Ford is going to run against Jimmy Carter in 1976. Jimmy Carter campaigned as an outsider. Even though this was not his first political race, he definitely had really not entered national level politics before this point. He had never held a federal position. He had attended the U.S. Naval Academy. He'd worked as a peanut farmer. And he basically ran on a platform of distrust of the federal government and career politicians at the national level. He really wanted to capitalize on the dissatisfaction and discontent that people had with the national government in the wake of the Watergate scandal and all of this political corruption that we also saw with Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, who had been convicted on political corruption and tax evasion charges before his resignation from vice president. And in many ways, Carter, who is running for the Democratic Party, echoes earlier progressive movements that we saw at the tail end of the Gilded Age in the beginning of the 1900s. Carter was a Southern Baptist, and many of his ideas about domestic policy are very reminiscent of the social gospel movement that we talked about in the late 1800s. This belief in providing short-term charity and aids to those who need it, but also working to get the government to fix problems in the system to help address issues of poverty and inequality. Carter also advocated for a more efficient government, for more environmental conservation, and also to promote public morality. Again, shades of these kind of progressive movements. Carter also advocated for a change in Cold War policy to focus on the issue of human rights. And Carter is going to change how the United States does business in foreign policy. In particular, his first question when trying to determine our relationship with another nation will be, what is their track record on human rights? Do they give their people freedoms? And this is going to begin a very long career for Jimmy Carter in human rights causes. He's had one of the more interesting post-presidential careers of any modern president. He's probably best known for his work for Habitat for Humanity, but he also does do a lot of other high-level stuff as well, including negotiating peace treaties overseas. This is partly inspired by his religious background, but it's also going to be inspired by the rise in human rights organizations like Amnesty International that become increasingly popular in the 1970s. And Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign really resonates with a lot of people, and he's successful at defeating Gerald Ford. Now, when Carter comes into office, one of the first things he has to address is the economy, because that was a big campaign issue. While Carter is a Democrat, he is at odds with the Democratic Party very frequently because the Democratic Party was more concerned in the 1970s with social issues than they were with economic policies. And in many cases, if you look at Carter's domestic policies when it comes to the economy, he looks a lot more like the Republican Party. He wanted to cut domestic spending. He embraced the idea of deregulation in certain industries like trucking and airlines. He urged the Fed to raise interest rates, and he also supported Congress repealing usury laws in 1980. If you have no idea what that term means, basically this is related to the amount of interest you can legally charge somebody. In particular, this is why credit card interest rates are very high today. Prior to 1980, there were laws in place that limited the amount of interest you could be charged for a loan or for a credit card account. Carter tries to address the energy crisis by promoting nuclear energy as an alternative to oil. And by 1977, the United States had over 200 nuclear power plants across the United States. But what pumps the brakes on this exploration of nuclear energy is going to be an accident at the 3 Mile Island plant in Pennsylvania. At 3 Mile Island, the plant there ended up suffering a failure and leaking radioactive steam, which prompted fears over the safety of nuclear power. Just how clean was this energy if we had a disaster at the reactor? Now, please note, you're probably thinking when I talk about nuclear power and disaster, you're probably immediately jumping to Chernobyl, which has been made more popular recently by a recent miniseries on the Chernobyl disaster. It's a little early yet. That's not in the 1970s, that's in the 1980s. Now, as I mentioned, Carter's first operating assumption in foreign policy is that we're only going to do business with nations that respect the human rights of their people. So Carter is going to be a little bit less concerned with the issue of communism. That's secondary for him as to whether you're communist or anti-communist. Primarily, we're going to do business with you based on your human rights track record. And because of that, Carter actually changes the relationship that prior administrations had had with nations like Argentina and El Salvador, where the United States had previously supported these regimes because they were anti-communist, but Carter cut off aid and diplomatic relationships because of human rights abuses. For example, in Argentina in 1978, he cut off contact after the Argentinian Dirty War killed somewhere between 10,000 to 30,000 Argentinian citizens. In El Salvador, death squads murdered civilians who opposed totalitarian rule, and in one famous incident, murdered 4 American nuns who were there as missionaries. Carter will cut off contact with El Salvador, diplomatic contact as well, in 1979. And really, Carter is trying to change the trajectory of foreign policy to emphasize not our contest with the Soviet Union, our showdown over communism versus capitalism and democracy, but rather to embrace a foreign policy that emphasized protecting human rights, minimizing poverty, and de-escalating nuclear buildup. To that end, Carter will pardon Vietnam War draft dodgers. In 1978, Carter will sign a treaty to formally return control of the Panama Canal Zone to the Panama government as of the year 2000, believing that this was a corrective after Teddy Roosevelt had posted that he took Panama to build the Panama Canal. In 1979, Carter will be instrumental in brokering a peace deal at Camp David between Egypt and Israel. But despite the support of human rights, the United States continued to look the other way in some circumstances where the Allies were too important or whether there was a kind of significant reason to hold over the old line from prior administrations. And in particular, the issue of Iran became explosive during Carter's time in office. Remember, the United States government, including the CIA, had been involved in overthrowing an elected government in Iran in the 1950s and installing in its place the Shah. The Shah was anti-communist, but not great on human rights track records. And in particular, the Shah had a habit of using a secret police force to target his political opponents. This rubbed many Iranians the wrong way, and the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was inspired by a Muslim cleric named Ayatollah Khomeini, which overthrew the Shah and established an Islamic republic. This is one of the first expressions of religious fundamentalism in Middle Eastern politics, what we call Islamism, and that's not to be confused with the religion of Islam. Islamism is about establishing a very sort of fundamental conservative religious state with the basis of a very fundamental conservative interpretation of Islam that does not reflect mainstream Islam worldwide. Now, this revolution in Iran provoked a hostage crisis when 66 Americans were taken from the U.S. Embassy after the Shah, who had fled Iran, was granted medical treatment in the United States. While 14 hostages were freed relatively quickly, the remaining hostages were not freed until early 1981. So this took place over 3 calendar years, from 1979 to 1981. The other flashpoint for Carter in his foreign policy is going to be what's happening in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is oftentimes called the Soviet Vietnam because the Soviet government struggles with Afghanistan in the same way that the United States government struggled with Vietnam. The Soviet Union begins getting involved in Afghanistan in 1979 to prop up a communist and Soviet-friendly government against another attempted Islamic fundamentalist insurgency, seeking to do the same thing in Afghanistan that had happened in Iran to establish a fundamentalist Islamic state. Because these fundamentalists were anti-communist, Jimmy Carter issued what he called the Carter Doctrine that said the United States would use military force if necessary to defend interests in the Persian Gulf and to help anybody fighting against communism. The Afghanistan conflict and the issuing of the Carter Doctrine sours the previous thawed relationship between the US and the Soviet Union, and the United States begins providing aid to the Islamic fundamentalists opposing the Soviet-backed government. And after a decade-long war, the Islamic fundamentalists won and became known as the Taliban. Yes, that is right. The US was bankrolling the Taliban because they opposed the Soviet Union throughout the 1980s. We were doing things like giving them aid money and military training and military supplies. And yes, that will come back to haunt us in a future session.